So next to the podium we've got Evelyn O'Loughlin, CEO of Volunteering SA and NT since 2008. Evelyn has over 20 years experience in senior and executive management roles both in South Australia and in Europe. Initially a secondary school teacher and lecturer at TAFE, she worked for 6 years in state government positions prior to spending 11 years overseas with a multinational and a London-based organisation. During her time there, she gained additional skills in large contract negotiations, product and program development, marketing, international business development, sales and partnership programs. Sounds amazing. But I did want to add to this that during this time she also had a fascinating home. So you'll have to ask her about that on break. With a passion for assisting everyone to be their best, Evelyn is presenting to us on volunteering, the lifeblood of the Australian economy and environment. Over to you, Evelyn.
Thank you, Leanne, and thanks for the invitation today. And to Jerry, thank you very much. It's terrific to be here. Before I start, I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the lands of the Kaurna people. My own environmental credentials are pretty pitiful, as my husband keeps reminding me. He went to uni with Marianne Healy, so his environmental credentials are really good. And he's also on the board of Landscape Partnerships and is heavily committed to the work that you do in his own volunteering. Mine are not so good. I'm going to start off, I'll start off by asking you how many people in the room, if you put your hand up, actually undertake voluntary activity in your communities? I don't think there's anyone that doesn't. How many consider yourself a volunteer? And that's about a half. And the interesting reason why I did that is because sometimes we get hooked up on the label of what is a volunteer, yet we all contribute very heavily to our communities. And when I talk about volunteering, it's often in a definition that we have accepted as an international definition of what volunteering is, which we'll go through just very briefly. But sometimes we don't identify ourselves as volunteers. So I'll start off by asking you to imagine a world without volunteers. Now, unfortunately, some of these scenes are way too common for us. Hospitals without any volunteers. That might be familiar. That's a true picture from up in Queensland a couple of years ago. Some great images. And without environmental volunteering, that's the sort of environments that we might be looking at. Sports volunteering, and I'm sure people that work that help with sport don't consider themselves volunteers. Who would feed the homeless and the hungry? Who would raise funds to support work? Meals on Wheels. Don't look at the hygiene aspects of that particular dish. The pageant's coming up, and I'm volunteering for that. And we'll start off the presentation today with the thought for the day, which I thought was really pertinent because it's from somebody that knows your work very well. Whilst the volunteer nature of Landcare is an inherent and essential part of Landcare, managing volunteers in a safe and professional manner requires a system and staff structure to facilitate this, and that's from Philip Moran up in Noosa. And I thought it was really pertinent to focus on the contribution that volunteers make, the lifeblood of the community, to the Australian economy, but also the systems of support that volunteers need in order to achieve the best possible outcomes for their volunteering. Very briefly, this is who we are. We're a not-for-profit organisation, 31 years old, active in all of those areas. I won't dwell on that. I'm sure you'll get the slides probably after. We measure ourselves on our own effectiveness, and we do this by going out to the some 2,000 organisations we work with every year, And we work across all of the not-for-profit and government sectors, so the arts, the environment, aged care, sport and rec. And those figures just show that we do a reasonably good job in what we do, but we can always get better. So here's the definition of volunteering, which is an international definition: of benefit to the community and to the person volunteering, to be of your own free will without coercion or financial payment, very different to reimbursement, and in designated volunteer positions only, and that relies on the concept of formal volunteering. I've been doing a lot of talking this week. That won't come as any surprise to you. People volunteer for lots of different reasons, and some of them are outlined on this slide. Pardon me. But this one I do want to look at a little bit more closely. Volunteering to the Australian economy, your economic contribution. Everybody in this room put their hand up and said they undertook voluntary activity in their communities. Well, when you count all of that up, that comes to $200 billion, not million, billion dollars worth of value to the Australian economy. Bigger than the mining industry, bigger than manufacturing, bigger than construction. And I think it's worth taking a minute to pause on that, because as a group, we don't consider ourselves an industry or a sector as a whole. We do come from different backgrounds, but when you add it all up, what we do is phenomenal. And you might be surprised to know that that $200 billion worth of value to the Australian economy was undertaken, the calculations were undertaken by Dr. Liesl O'Dwyer at the University of Adelaide. And Liesl actually used the figure of $7 an hour. Now, I don't know if anyone undertakes paid work for $7 an hour in Australia. I did hear that there were some Filipino people for $3 an hour up on one of the rigs this morning. But the reason she chose $7 an hour, because she never thought anyone would believe her if she used the average wage of $25 an hour, which would make that $800 billion. Some other statistics there that I think are important to recognise. There are 5 volunteers to every 1 paid worker in the not-for-profit sector. In South Australia, our economic contribution is $5 billion, or 11.5% of the gross domestic product, and that's measured from around 900,000 people aged 15 years and over here in South Australia. So some of the things you may want to consider if you're looking to harness the efforts of more people in volunteering in your work, in your livelihoods, in your environment, there is an increased professionalisation of people management, and that includes paid and unpaid. The volunteer workforce is ageing. We all know people lead busy lives and have less time for volunteering, although we'll talk about people in country areas who do a lot more than their city counterparts. Corporate volunteering is a trend, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And episodic volunteering, I want to come in, I want to do something, then I want to get out, tends to suit younger people. Some of the external influences in our world, which you may come across, coming from the 1st of January, the bullying and harassment laws that Fair Work Australia is putting out, will capture volunteers. And it's worth noting that, because there will be matters that you will need to consider in your own volunteering. The harmonisation of work health and safety legislation, no doubt you're familiar with that. Also, volunteers are considered in an organisation that has paid employees to be deemed the same rights and protections as paid workers. Not in organisations that have no paid workers. In completely voluntary associations, that doesn't apply. There was a productivity commission review into the not-for-profit sector that recommended about 70 recommendations of how we can work more effectively with government. Some of the other areas that affect volunteering but may have a lesser effect on yourselves, the aged care and disability reforms that are underway. Some of the challenges facing the sector. Well, we do a survey every year, and recruiting and retaining volunteers since last year has gone down from 4% to 38%. The burden of administration will be no doubt familiar to you, gone up 6% to 28%. Red tape, I don't know why that says pay. I don't think that's meant to say pay, policies and procedures. And the lack of funding for volunteer programs has stayed about steady from last year. Just a few more pictures to remind ourselves of the difference there. And the last part of what I want to talk about is something that I think is important to reflect on. Back in 2001 was the United Nations International Year of the Volunteer. In 2011 we had the 10th anniversary. But back 13 years ago, a lot of people got together and put down 6 really important things about volunteering. I don't think we've progressed that well in the last 13 years, but I'll let you assess that. The National Agenda on Volunteering said it was really important that we publicly respect and value in endearing, formal and tangible ways the essential contribution that volunteers make to building and sustaining the Australian economy. Are we better than that than we were in 2001? I think probably that one we are. Ensure that volunteers have legal status and are afforded protection through every piece of legislation and public policy that affects them in their work. Well, that is something that we know is not the case. For example, I mentioned earlier the Fair Work legislation that's going to come through on bullying and harassment, and that only again applies to organisations that have specific classifications as being a PCBU. You may be familiar with that, but not for voluntary organisations. So if you're a volunteer in a completely volunteer-run organisation and you're being bullied and harassed, where do you go? There is nowhere. None of the state laws protect you because you have to fit into their definition of Safe Work SA's definitions. So what we're doing at Volunteering SA and NT, I'm the chair of a working party, an Australia-wide working party called the Volunteer Rights and Advocacy Working Party, with all my CEO colleagues from around Australia, but also a couple of lawyers and a couple of policy people. And we're collecting data and we'll be coming out to volunteers and voluntary organisations in the next few weeks, probably at the beginning of the year, to understand the depth and breadth of issues that volunteers face. We want to do that so that we can help government to determine what the best possible course of protections for volunteers is. Do we need a volunteer ombudsman? Do we need an advocacy service? Do we need something that's legally binding? Or do we change, if we do all of that, do we change the very nature of what makes your voluntary contribution so special? Ensure that all new legislation, laws and public policies developed at any level of government which may affect volunteers and their work works only to facilitate and sustain volunteering. Now, in your sphere of volunteering, you may have thoughts on whether that's being better achieved than it was in 2001. Acknowledge the activity of volunteering is not without cost. And I think that's an important one, and volunteers should be reimbursed for the valuable services that they provide. Ensure excellence in all levels of volunteer involvement and volunteer management in order to encourage, protect and enhance the work of volunteers. Now, I think that that's an interesting one because volunteers wear many hats. We had a national conference recently with 80 speakers. The combined total of the speakers volunteering was 1,500 years, around 19 years per person. Now, it's interesting because part of our work is to provide an independent voice for volunteers, but we also work with the organisations that utilise volunteers to make sure that volunteers are afforded the best possible volunteering opportunity, and sometimes that requires training, sometimes that requires upskilling of management, and it's really important to understand that in our day and age, as was the first quote, that volunteering doesn't, volunteers need to be supported by adequate management practices. And then lastly, to ensure that volunteering is a potent, dynamic and unifying social force for community benefit by acknowledging and accepting that it is a diverse and evolving activity. And one of the really important points to note there is corporate involvement. Now, I'm not sure if you do get corporate organisations to support your work or if you're interested in that, but certainly corporates, in order to satisfy some of their requirements on their triple bottom line, are very keen to get involved in volunteering and in community. But they won't do it in places where they don't feel that organisations are adhering to good practice. I'm going to finish off by showing you the national standards, which some of you may be familiar with. They're free, they're on Volunteering Australia's website, and they give you guidance as to what best practices in volunteering can be. And I strongly recommend you have a look at that, because the corporates that we work with won't allow any of their workers to work in organisations that don't adhere to the national standards, for example. And I just want to finish off by saying thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you about something you may know about, but I'm not sure how many in the room knew that your contribution to the Australian economy is so potent and so magnificent. We, our own organisation with about 28 paid staff, has support of around 80 volunteers, including our Aboriginal reference group on volunteering that is 10 years old next year, a model for our work that is not replicated anywhere else in Australia, we know that. And it's important to acknowledge that sometimes the people that are around you have a passion and love for what you do, and being paid is only part of the equation. And I think the work that you undertake in your communities should be recognised at every opportunity, and I'd like to say thank you to you as well. Thank you.